There is a plant growing in gardens across Britain and Northern Europe right now that people have been trying to kill for over 200 years. They have poured boiling water on it, smothered it in plastic sheeting, dug up entire flower beds to rip out its roots, and every single spring it comes back. Ground elder, Agopodium podagraria, is the plant that will not die. That was the 21st century. Go back to the 9th century, and monks in stone-walled monasteries across England and France were on their knees in garden soil doing the exact opposite. They were planting it, protecting it, tending it like something precious. Ground elder's one defining trait, the thing that makes it the most cursed weed in the modern garden, is the same trait that made it invaluable to those monks. Its refusal to die. Its ability to spread from the tiniest scrap of root into a colony that no amount of pulling or cutting can stop. In the hands of a medieval healer trying to keep a monastery full of ailing men alive through another winter, that kind of resilience was not a curse. It was a gift. You planted it once and you had medicine forever. The monks called it bishop's weed. The Latin name, podagraria, comes from podagra, the old medical term for gout. And gout was everywhere in medieval Europe, swelling the joints of abbots, bishops, and anyone wealthy enough to eat rich food and drink wine by the barrel. Ground elder was the quiet answer, a poultice of crushed leaves pressed against a swollen knee or a throbbing toe, a bitter tea brewed from the dried foliage and sipped through gritted teeth. It was not glamorous medicine. It was not the kind of cure that gets written about in gold leaf on vellum. It was a weed in a garden, doing a job. And it did that job well enough that monks planted it at nearly every major monastery, from Yorkshire to Bavaria, from Normandy to southern Sweden. They carried cuttings along pilgrimage routes and trade roads, tucking root fragments into saddlebags the way a traveler might pack aspirin today. This is the story of how a quiet, unassuming plant spent 1,000 years being one of the most trusted medicines in Europe, and how the very thing that made it useful, its total refusal to disappear, turned it into public enemy number one in every garden on the continent. And it starts not with the monks, but with the people who brought ground elder to Europe in the first place. The Romans. The Roman legions moved across Europe carrying more than swords and siege equipment. They carried seeds, cuttings, roots. Wherever the empire expanded, Roman supply lines brought the plants that soldiers and settlers needed to survive and eat well in foreign territory. Sweet chestnut trees for flour, walnut trees for oil, grapevines for wine, and tucked in among all of it, ground elder. The plant almost certainly originated somewhere in the mountainous belt, stretching from the Caucasus through Central Asia, a region where it still grows wild today in rocky meadows and along shaded riverbanks. The Romans recognized it as something useful, a green vegetable that could be harvested in early spring when almost nothing else was growing, and a medicinal herb with a reputation for easing aching joints. They did not worship it. They did not write poems about it. They packed it alongside their other practical imports and carried it north. And we know this because of where it shows up in the ground. Archaeobotanists working at Roman fort sites in Britain, along Hadrian's Wall, and at villa complexes in the south of England, have found ground elder growing in and around the ruins. The same pattern appears at Roman settlements along the Rhine in Germany and at outposts in what is now Austria and Switzerland. The plant clusters at these sites the way pigeons cluster around old churches. It stays where it was put, long after the people who put it there are gone. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that comes later. Ground elder does not spread by seed in any meaningful way. Its seeds are small and rarely viable. Instead, it spreads underground through a dense, tangled web of white rhizomes, horizontal root structures that snake through the soil just below the surface. A single rhizome fragment, even a piece just 1 or 2 centimeters long, can sprout a brand new plant. And each new plant sends out its own rhizomes, which send out more, which send out more. This means that when the Romans planted ground elder at a fort in northern England 2,000 years ago, they were not just planting a herb, they were starting a colony with no natural expiration date. The plants growing at some of those Roman sites today maybe genetically identical to the ones Roman hands pressed into the soil, not descendants. The same organism, still expanding, still alive, connected by an unbroken underground network that has been creeping outward for 20 centuries. The Romans themselves never had to deal with the consequences of this. Their gardens were managed, maintained, and enclosed. When a fort was abandoned, the infrastructure crumbled, the roads cracked, the bathhouses filled with mud. The ground elder kept growing. It had no idea the empire was over. In a few hundred years, the people who inherited those Roman roads and ruined forts would understand exactly what this plant was capable of. They would not curse it for that, not yet. Instead, they would see its stubborn, unkillable nature and think the same thing the Romans thought. This is useful. This can help us. The same network of routes and roads and trade routes that the Romans built to hold their empire together was about to carry ground elder into the hands of the only people in medieval Europe who had the knowledge, the patience, and the spiritual motivation to turn a simple weed into organized medicine: the monks. After Rome fell, Europe fractured, the roads cracked, the trade networks collapsed. And for the millions of ordinary people scattered across the continent, the most basic question of daily life became brutally simple. When you got sick, who could help you? The answer, for roughly 700 years, was monks. From the 5th century onward, Christian monasteries became the only institutions in Europe with the resources, the literacy, and the organizational discipline to practice anything resembling systematic medicine. The average village had no doctor, no apothecary, no written knowledge of herbs or treatments passed down in any structured way. The monastery had all of it. Monks could read Latin texts on Greek and Roman medicine. They had libraries where that knowledge was copied by hand, generation after generation, preserved through wars and famines and plagues that wiped out everything around them. And they had gardens. The physic garden was standard at any major monastery. A walled or fenced enclosure, usually close to the infirmary, where monks cultivated the plants they needed to treat the sick. Lavender for headaches, fennel for digestion, sage for sore throats, comfrey for broken bones, and ground elder for the condition that plagued the religious establishment more than almost any other ailment: gout. Gout was the disease of the well-fed. It strikes when uric acid builds up in the blood and crystallizes in the joints, causing episodes of excruciating pain, swelling, and redness, most commonly in the big toe but capable of attacking knees, wrists, and fingers too. And the medieval monastic diet, rich in preserved meats, salted fish, cheese, beer, and wine, was practically designed to trigger it. Abbots suffered from gout. Bishops suffered from gout. Senior monks who had spent decades eating at the high table suffered from gout. The very men running the monasteries were the ones most likely to need the cure growing in their gardens. So they grew it deliberately, carefully. Ground elder was planted in physic gardens at monasteries across England, France, Germany, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. The monks gave it the name bishop's weed, not because bishops discovered it, but because bishops were its most frequent patients. That name stuck for centuries. In parts of England, older gardeners still call it bishop's weed today, even if they have long forgotten why. The plant earned its place in those gardens honestly. It required almost no attention. Once planted, it came back every spring without fail. One of the first green things to push through the cold soil in March and April, right when the monastery's stores of dried herbs from the previous summer were running low. It did not need good soil. It did not need full sun. It grew in the shaded corners beside stone walls and under fruit trees, exactly the kind of marginal space that other medicinal herbs refused to tolerate. For monks managing dozens of crops across limited garden beds, ground elder was the plant that took care of itself, and they did not keep it to themselves. Monks carried root cuttings to daughter houses and new foundations. When a monastery in Yorkshire established a priory in a neighboring county, ground elder went with it, packed into the same carts as the altar, silver, and the manuscript collection. Pilgrimage routes became plant distribution networks. A monk walking from Canterbury to a sister house in Normandy might carry a bundle of rhizome fragments wrapped in damp cloth, a living care package for the brothers on the other end. I mean, think about that for a second. The plant that millions of modern gardeners consider an unstoppable plague was, for centuries, a gift. Something you brought to people you cared about. Something you planted to ease their suffering. And the evidence of all that careful, deliberate planting is still visible today. At the ruins of Revolks Abbey in North Yorkshire, ground elder grows thick among the crumbled stone walls, 500 years after the last monk left. At old monastery sites in Sweden and Denmark, it carpets the ground in places where no one has gardened for centuries. Botanists, mapping the distribution of ground elder across northern Europe, have noticed that its densest populations frequently cluster around former monastic sites, a living archaeological fingerprint of a medical tradition that ended half a millennium ago. The monks planted it because it worked. They spread it because people were in pain, and every spring it kept coming back, reliable as prayer, asking nothing in return. If the monks had stopped there, kept it inside their walls, rationed the cuttings, treated it as something to be controlled rather than shared, this would be a very different story. They did not stop there. The monks did not have clinical trials. They did not have laboratories or peer-reviewed journals or double-blind studies. What they had was centuries of accumulated observation, written down in herbals and passed along monastery infirmary walls in careful Latin shorthand. And when it came to ground elder, those observations were remarkably specific. The treatment was straightforward. Fresh leaves were harvested in spring and early summer, when the plant was young and the foliage was at its most potent. The leaves were crushed, sometimes mixed with a small amount of animal fat or oil to help them hold together, and pressed directly against the swollen joint as a poultice. The compress was wrapped in linen and left for several hours, sometimes overnight. For internal use, the leaves were dried, crumbled, and steeped in hot water to make a bitter tea that monks drank through the worst flare-ups of joint pain. In some monasteries, the youngest spring leaves were simply eaten raw as a vegetable, tossed into soups or chewed on their own. A kind of preventive maintenance that doubled as food when winter stores were running thin. None of this was glamorous. Nobody was performing miracles. A monk with gout, so bad he could not walk to morning prayers, would have a poultice of crushed ground elder leaves bound to his foot and a cup of foul-tasting tea pressed into his hand, and within a few days, the swelling would ease enough for him to stand again. That was the full extent of the treatment. Leaves on skin, bitter water, time. And it kept working, generation after generation. Across hundreds of monasteries and several centuries, the treatment persisted because the monks kept recording the same result. Ground elder eased the swelling. It reduced the heat in inflamed joints. It did not cure gout permanently. Nothing available in the medieval period could, but it managed the symptoms well enough that monks returned to it over and over again, preferring it to many of the more exotic and expensive remedies circulating through the medieval pharmacopoeia. By the late 16th century, the plant's medical reputation had spread well beyond monastery walls. John Gerard, the English herbalist and barber surgeon, included ground elder in his Herbal of 1597, noting its traditional use for treating joint pain and inflammation. He described it plainly, without exaggeration, as a plant that had been used for this purpose for as long as anyone could remember. A few decades later, Nicholas Culpeper gave it a similar entry in his Complete Herbal of 1653, recommending it for gout and sciatica, and affirming what generations of monks had already established. The plant worked. Everyone who used it said so. That was just the story the herbalists recorded, though. Behind the empirical observations, something was actually happening at the chemical level that the monks and the herbalists had no way of seeing. Modern phytochemical analysis of Agopodium podagraria has identified a range of bioactive compounds in the leaves and stems, including falcarindiol, a polyacetyl compound with documented anti-inflammatory properties, and several flavonoids that appear to inhibit the same inflammatory pathways targeted by modern nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Researchers in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe have published studies showing that ground elder extracts reduce markers of inflammation in laboratory settings. The concentrations involved are modest. Nobody is suggesting that a poultice of crushed leaves rivals ibuprofen, but the direction of the effect is real, measurable, and consistent with exactly what the monks described. In plain terms, the monks were right. They did not know why it worked. They could not have explained the biochemistry, but their method of testing, which was simply to use the plant, watch what happened, write it down, and repeat for several hundred years, arrived at the same conclusion that laboratory equipment confirmed 5 centuries later. Ground elder genuinely reduces inflammation. People thought they had the full picture of medieval herbal medicine, that it was all superstition, humoral theory, and guesswork. They were wrong. At least some of it was careful, repeated observation of real effects, and ground elder is one of the clearest examples. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. I break down stories like this every week, the kind of history that hides in plain sight. Enter Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist who, in 1753, gave nearly every known plant in Europe its formal Latin name. When he reached this particular species, he called it Agopodium podagraria. Agopodium, from the Greek for goat's foot, a reference to the shape of the leaves. Podagraria from podagra, gout. He could have named it for its flowers. He could have named it for its habitat or its leaf pattern. He chose to name it for the disease it treated. Even in the Age of Enlightenment, 300 years after the monastic golden age of herbal medicine, the plant's identity was still inseparable from its role as a healer. Linnaeus knew what the monks knew. Ground elder was the gout plant. That was its job. And for as long as someone was paying attention, keeping the gardens tended, and the rhizomes contained within their beds, that job was all it did. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. Nobody was asking what would happen when the gardens were abandoned. In 1536, King Henry VIII began dissolving the monasteries of England. The reasons were political, financial, and personal, tangled up in his break with Rome and his desperate need for money and a male heir. Over the next 5 years, more than 800 monasteries, priories, and friaries were shut down. Their lands were seized. Their buildings were stripped for stone and lead. Their monks were pensioned off, scattered, or absorbed into parish life. The libraries were looted. The infirmaries were emptied. And the physic gardens, those carefully tended plots where generations of healers had cultivated the plants that kept their communities alive, were left to fend for themselves. Nobody thought about the gardens. There were abbeys to demolish and gold plate to melt down. A patch of herbs behind a crumbling infirmary wall was not worth a line in the king's inventory. Ground elder did not need anyone to think about it. That was the whole point. Within a few years of abandonment, the physic garden beds at dissolved monasteries across England began to blur. The neat rows of medicinal herbs, the ones that needed weeding and watering and careful seasonal attention, withered and disappeared. The lavender dried out, the fennel bolted and died back. The comfrey retreated to isolated clumps, and through all of it, ground elder advanced. Its rhizomes pushed outward from the beds where monks had contained them, creeping under paths, threading through foundation stones, colonizing the untended ground around chapel walls and cloister ruins. Every fragment of root that a passing cartwheel or a grazing animal broke off and dragged to a new patch of soil became a new colony. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The plant that monks had carefully nurtured as a blessing was becoming something else entirely. Not because it changed, it did exactly what it had always done. The only difference was that nobody was managing it anymore. The same pattern played out across Northern Europe. In Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, the decline of monastic life through the Reformation left hundreds of former monastery sites unmanaged. In Germany and the Low Countries, religious wars and political upheaval did the same. Everywhere the monks retreated, their ground elder stayed behind. And everywhere it stayed behind, it spread. By the 17th and 18th centuries, ground elder had moved well beyond its old monastery boundaries. It followed hedgerows and field edges. It colonized churchyards and cottage gardens. It crept along the borders of country estates where gardeners had never planted it and could not explain where it had come from. It became, gradually and then completely, a weed. Not a rare or exotic invader, but the common, boring, relentless kind. The kind that shows up in your garden one spring and never leaves. The Victorians were the first generation to truly hate it. Their approach to gardening was ornamental, precise, and obsessively controlled. Flower beds were geometric. Lawns were rolled flat. Every plant had a designated place and a decorative purpose. Ground elder, with its plain white flower clusters and its habit of swallowing entire borders in a single growing season, was the opposite of everything a Victorian garden was supposed to be. The plant's medicinal history was largely forgotten by then, or dismissed as peasant superstition. What remained was an ugly, aggressive weed that mocked every attempt at control. And somehow, despite all of that, ground elder still managed to cross the Atlantic. It arrived in North America, most likely in the 18th or 19th century, almost certainly as a deliberate import. Gardeners brought the variegated form, the one with white-edged leaves, because it looked attractive in shaded borders, a manageable ornamental accent, a charming ground cover. The variegated cultivar is still sold in garden centers across the United States and Canada today. So, yeah, not great. The non-variegated wild form came too, probably as a hitchhiker in soil or packing material on ships. It established itself across the northeastern United States and southeastern Canada and did there exactly what it had done in Europe. It spread. It ignored every boundary. It outlasted every effort to remove it. American gardeners who had never heard of medieval monasteries or monastic physic gardens or the Latin word podagraria found themselves fighting the same plant that had been quietly conquering European soil since the Roman Empire. The one trait monks valued above all others, the plant's absolute, stubborn, biological refusal to disappear, was about to define its reputation for the next 300 years. And not in the way the monks would have wanted. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense. Because even now, even after centuries of people trying to destroy this plant, there are people who are choosing to grow it again. In Britain alone, ground elder is present in an estimated 2 out of every 5 gardens. Gardening forums are filled with threads that read like battlefield dispatches. People describe years-long campaigns of digging, pulling, poisoning, and smothering, only to find fresh green shoots pushing through the soil the following spring. The Royal Horticultural Society lists it among the most difficult weeds to control in the United Kingdom. Professional landscapers have been known to quote a job, learn that ground elder is involved, and politely decline the work. The methods people use against it border on siege warfare. Thick black plastic sheeting laid over infested beds for 2 or 3 full growing seasons, starving the rhizomes of light. Systemic herbicides like glyphosate painted carefully onto individual leaves to avoid killing everything else in the border. Complete excavation of flower beds to a depth of 30 centimeters or more, with every scrap of soil sifted by hand for root fragments. And even after all of that, a single overlooked piece of rhizome, a pale white thread no thicker than a pencil lead, can restart the entire colony. Gardeners have reported removing ground elder from a bed, replanting with fresh soil, and finding it growing back within 6 months from a fragment that survived under a brick edging stone. The frustration is real. The expense is real. The sheer amount of human labor spent fighting this one plant across Northern Europe every year would be staggering if anyone could calculate it. And yet, in the past 10 to 15 years, something has started to shift. Not in the gardens where people are still fighting it, but at the edges, in the kitchens and the hedgerows and the quiet corners of the internet, where a different kind of relationship with plants is being rebuilt. Foragers rediscovered ground elder. Or rather, they remembered what everyone used to know. The young spring leaves, harvested before the plant flowers, are edible, more than edible. Chefs in Scandinavia, where foraging never fully fell out of fashion, began featuring ground elder in restaurants. It tastes somewhere between parsley and celery, with a slight peppery edge that works in salads, soups, pestos, and as a simple steamed green. In Copenhagen and Stockholm, it showed up on tasting menus. In English foraging communities, it became a running joke, the one weed you never have to worry about running out of. At the same time, a smaller and quieter group of researchers and herbalists began circling back to the plant's original purpose. Studies out of Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic states examined ground elder's traditional medicinal uses with modern analytical tools and kept arriving at the same conclusion the monks had reached by observation alone. The anti-inflammatory properties are real. The compounds are identifiable. The effect is modest, but it is not imaginary. Ground elder does what the people who planted it said it would do. There is something almost funny about it. Millions of people across Europe and North America spend money, time, weekends, and years of their lives trying to eradicate a plant that their ancestors spent centuries deliberately growing. A plant that was brought here on purpose, spread on purpose, cultivated on purpose, specifically because it was useful. The monks did not make a mistake when they planted ground elder. They made a choice. They looked at a world full of suffering, at men doubled over with inflamed joints who could not walk or work or kneel to pray, and they planted the thing that helped. And they planted it to last because they wanted the medicine to outlive them. It did. The ground elder growing through the cracked foundation stones of Revolks Abbey in North Yorkshire is not invading anything. It is still doing the job the monks gave it. Still growing in the same soil, still pushing up the same plain green